The year was 1942, and across the vast expanse of Southeast Asia, the impossible was happening. European flags that had flown for centuries over bustling ports and colonial capitals were being torn down by forces that Western powers had dismissed as inferior. In a matter of weeks, empires that had taken generations to build were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. Yet these weren't just military defeats. They were the opening shots of a transformation so profound that it would reshape the entire global order. What you're about to discover are the forgotten battles that shattered the myth of European invincibility forever. These weren't the famous clashes you learned about in school. These were the conflicts that military historians whisper about, the battles that colonial powers tried desperately to erase from memory because they revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of empire itself. Picture this. You're a Dutch admiral in February 1942, commanding what you believe is a formidable naval force. Your ships are crewed by experienced sailors, your officers trained in the finest naval academies of Europe. You've been told that Asian forces lack the discipline and technology to challenge European supremacy. Then, in the space of a single afternoon, your entire fleet is sent to the bottom of the Java Sea, and with it, 300 years of Dutch colonial dominance in Southeast Asia. Or imagine you're a French general in 1954, confident that your superior firepower and European military doctrine will crush a ragtag band of Vietnamese guerrillas. 57 days later, you're signing surrender documents in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, and France's colonial empire is collapsing across 2 continents. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a cascade of defeats that would fundamentally alter how the world understood power, resistance, and the very concept of empire. By the time the smoke cleared, the global balance had shifted irreversibly from European colonial capitals to the capitals of newly independent Asian nations. But here's what makes these battles truly fascinating. They weren't won through overwhelming numbers or superior technology. They were won through something far more powerful: strategic brilliance, unbreakable determination, and the kind of innovative thinking that emerges when people are fighting not just for territory, but for the very soul of their nations. The Dutch had ruled the Indonesian archipelago for over 3 centuries. Their colonial administrators lived in magnificent mansions, their trading companies generated enormous profits, and their naval bases controlled the sea lanes that connected Asia to Europe. The Dutch East Indies was one of the most profitable colonies in history, producing rubber, oil, tin, and spices that filled European coffers. To the Dutch, their position seemed unshakable. Then came the morning of the 27th of February, 1942. Admiral Karel Doorman, commanding a hastily assembled fleet of Dutch, British, American, and Australian warships, received intelligence that a massive Japanese convoy was approaching Java. The convoy carried the troops that would complete Japan's conquest of the Dutch East Indies. This was the moment of truth. If Doorman could destroy the convoy, Dutch colonial rule might survive. If he failed, 3 centuries of empire would end in a single day. The Allied fleet was impressive on paper. 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers, representing the combined naval power of 4 Western nations. These ships had been built in the great shipyards of Europe and America, manned by sailors who considered themselves the inheritors of centuries of naval tradition. Surely such a force could handle whatever the Japanese might throw at them. What happened next shattered every assumption about naval warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese escort force, smaller but superbly coordinated, outmaneuvered the Allied ships with a precision that left European commanders stunned. Long-lance torpedoes, weapons of devastating accuracy, found their targets with deadly consistency. One by one, the Allied ships disappeared beneath the waves. The HNLMS de Ruyter, Doorman's flagship, took a torpedo hit that split her hull like paper. As the ship listed and began her final plunge, Doorman made a decision that epitomized the old colonial mindset. Rather than abandon ship, he chose to go down with his vessel, clinging to the traditions of European naval honor, even as those traditions proved utterly inadequate against Japanese innovation and tactical brilliance. The Java Sea turned into a graveyard of European naval power. The HMS Exeter, a British heavy cruiser that had fought valiantly against the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, was reduced to a burning hulk. The USS Houston, pride of the American Asiatic Fleet, fought until her ammunition was exhausted before succumbing to overwhelming Japanese firepower. Ship after ship vanished beneath the tropical waters, taking with them not just thousands of sailors, but the myth of Western naval supremacy. Within hours, the Japanese convoy reached Java's shores unopposed. The Dutch colonial army, already demoralized by the naval disaster, offered only token resistance. By the 8th of March, Lieutenant General Heinter Porten was signing the unconditional surrender of all Dutch forces in the East Indies. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. In less than 3 months, the Japanese had conquered territories that the Dutch had spent centuries accumulating. But the Battle of the Java Sea was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake that reverberated across the colonial world. For the first time in modern history, European naval power had been decisively crushed by an Asian fleet. The implications were staggering. If the Dutch, with their centuries of maritime experience and powerful allies, could be so thoroughly defeated, what did that say about European colonial rule everywhere? The impact on Indonesian society was immediate and profound. The Dutch had justified their colonial rule by claiming European superiority in technology, organization, and military prowess. The Japanese victory demolished these claims overnight. Suddenly, the European administrators who had seemed so powerful and untouchable were revealed as ordinary men whose authority rested not on inherent superiority, but on military force that could be challenged and defeated. Initially, many Indonesians welcomed the Japanese as liberators. After centuries of Dutch exploitation, any change seemed preferable to the colonial status quo. The Japanese, despite their own imperial ambitions, understood the psychological moment perfectly. They portrayed themselves as fellow Asians fighting against Western colonialism, tapping into resentments that had been building for generations. The Japanese occupation that followed was brutal and exploitative, but it inadvertently accelerated Indonesian nationalism in ways the Dutch had never imagined possible. Japanese administrators, needing local collaboration to govern effectively, promoted Indonesians to positions previously reserved for Europeans. Indonesian languages replaced Dutch in schools and government offices. Young Indonesians received military training and gained experience in administration and logistics. Most importantly, the myth of European invincibility was permanently shattered. Once people had seen European colonial administrators fleeing in panic, once they had witnessed European military forces surrendering unconditionally, the psychological foundations of colonial rule could never be fully restored. Even when the war ended, and some European powers attempted to reclaim their colonies, they faced populations that had fundamentally changed their understanding of power and resistance. The reverberations extended far beyond Indonesia. Across Southeast Asia, nationalist movements that had been suppressed or marginalized suddenly found new hope and inspiration. If the mighty Dutch Empire could fall in a matter of weeks, what other seemingly permanent structures might prove vulnerable to determined challenge? But the Java Sea was only the beginning. While the Dutch were losing their empire in a single decisive battle, other colonial powers were about to face even more prolonged and devastating challenges. In the jungles of Malaya, British forces were discovering that their own assumptions about colonial warfare were dangerously outdated. The Malayan emergency began not with grand declarations or massed armies, but with the crackle of flames consuming rubber plantations in the pre-dawn darkness of June 1948. British administrators, sipping their morning tea in colonial clubs across the peninsula, initially dismissed these attacks as isolated incidents by common bandits. They could not have been more wrong. What they were witnessing was the opening phase of one of the most sophisticated guerrilla campaigns in modern history, orchestrated by fighters who had learned their deadly skills from the British themselves. The irony was almost poetic in its cruelty. The communist guerrillas now melting back into the jungle after their midnight raids were veterans of the Malayan people's anti-Japanese army. These were men and women whom the British had trained, armed, and funded during World War II to fight against Japanese occupation forces. The very techniques they had taught their local allies, hit-and-run tactics, jungle survival, weapons maintenance, intelligence networks, were now being turned against them with devastating effectiveness. Chin Peng, the communist leader who would become Britain's most wanted man in Southeast Asia, had once received medals from British officers for his wartime service against the Japanese. Now he commanded an underground army that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish back into the green depths of the Malayan jungle before British forces could respond. The transformation from ally to enemy reflected the broader tragedy of post-war Southeast Asia, where yesterday's freedom fighters became tomorrow's terrorists depending on which flag they chose to serve. The scale of the challenge facing British colonial authorities was staggering. The Malayan National Liberation Army operated across a peninsula covered by some of the world's most impenetrable jungle terrain. Their fighters knew every trail, every river crossing, every cave that could serve as a weapons cache or medical station. They had support networks extending into every Chinese village, every rubber plantation, every tin mine where workers harbored grievances against colonial exploitation. British military commanders, trained in the conventional warfare of Europe, found themselves utterly unprepared for this new kind of conflict. Their heavy equipment was useless in terrain where a single sniper could pin down an entire company. Their intelligence networks, designed to monitor conventional military movements, proved helpless against an enemy that looked like civilians by day and warriors by night. Their supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of vulnerable road, became hunting grounds for guerrilla ambush parties. The human cost mounted relentlessly. Rubber planters were dragged from their beds and executed as symbols of colonial exploitation. Chinese shopkeepers who refused to pay revolutionary taxes found their businesses burned to ash. British soldiers, trained for the battlefields of Europe, died in unmarked jungle clearings. Their bodies sometimes never recovered from the green hell that had swallowed them. But the British response revealed something equally disturbing about the true nature of colonial rule. Faced with an enemy they could not identify or locate, colonial authorities resorted to collective punishment on a scale that would have shocked observers in peacetime Britain. Entire villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned to the ground. Thousands of Chinese civilians were rounded up and detained without trial in camps surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The forced resettlement program that followed was perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire conflict. Over 400,000 people, mostly Chinese squatters who had lived on the margins of colonial society, were herded into what the British euphemistically called new villages. These were essentially concentration camps, designed to cut off guerrilla supply lines by isolating potential supporters behind razor wire and armed guards. The official propaganda described these camps as humanitarian efforts to provide proper housing, medical care, and education to previously neglected populations. The reality was starkly different. Families were torn from homes they had built with their own hands and forced to live in barracks under constant surveillance. Their movements were restricted, their food rationed, their contact with the outside world monitored by British intelligence officers. Yet even this brutal approach failed to break guerrilla resistance. The communists adapted to every British countermeasure with a flexibility that frustrated colonial commanders. When their rural supply networks were disrupted, they developed urban cells that operated in broad daylight. When their weapons caches were discovered, they learned to manufacture explosives from agricultural chemicals. When their communications were intercepted, they developed codes so sophisticated that British intelligence officers spent months trying to crack them. The psychological warfare dimension of the conflict was equally sophisticated. Communist propaganda portrayed the struggle not as a fight between competing political ideologies, but as a war of racial liberation. They pointed to the obvious contradictions in British policy, asking why Chinese fighters, who had been heroes during the war against Japan, were now branded as terrorists for seeking the same independence that Britain had promised other nations. The message resonated powerfully among populations that had experienced both Japanese occupation and British colonial rule. Many had concluded that neither foreign ruler genuinely cared about local welfare. The Japanese had at least offered the rhetoric of Asian liberation from Western colonialism. The returning British offered only a return to the racial hierarchies and economic exploitation of the pre-war era. British forces found themselves fighting not just armed guerrillas, but an entire population that had lost faith in colonial legitimacy. Village headmen who had once been reliable collaborators now provided information reluctantly or not at all. Plantation workers who had previously accepted their subordinate status began questioning why British shareholders, thousands of miles away, should profit from their labor while they remained trapped in poverty. The conflict dragged on year after year, consuming resources that Britain could ill afford in the aftermath of World War II. Military expenditures soared as more troops were deployed to combat an enemy that seemed to multiply with each operation against them. The economic disruption to rubber and tin production, the very industries that made Malaya valuable to Britain, threatened to make the colony more expensive to maintain than it was worth. By the early 1950s, British commanders were beginning to understand that military force alone could not resolve the emergency. They needed a political solution that would address the underlying grievances that had driven people to support the guerrillas in the first place. But admitting this reality meant acknowledging that colonial rule itself was the problem, a conclusion that threatened the entire logic of the British Empire. The lessons learned in Malaya would be applied in later colonial conflicts around the world, but they came at an enormous cost in blood and treasure. More importantly, they demonstrated that the age of effortless colonial control was ending. Even the most sophisticated counterinsurgency techniques could not restore the automatic obedience that had once characterized colonial relationships. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the north, French forces in Indochina were discovering that their own assumptions about colonial warfare were equally outdated. The disaster that awaited them in the mountains of northern Vietnam would make the Malayan emergency look like a minor skirmish by comparison. The French return to Indochina in 1946 was supposed to be a triumphant restoration of colonial glory. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, arriving in Saigon with his staff officers and ceremonial uniforms, proclaimed that France would rebuild its empire stronger than ever. The tricolor flew once again over the governor's palace. French administrators reclaimed their colonial mansions, and European settlers returned to their plantations with dreams of restoring the profitable rubber and rice trade that had made Indochina the jewel of the French Empire. What they found instead was a country that had fundamentally changed during their absence. The Japanese occupation had not only destroyed French administrative structures, it had created something far more dangerous to colonial rule. A generation of Vietnamese who had tasted independence and would never willingly surrender it again. In the northern mountains, a former schoolteacher named Ho Chi Minh had declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and his military commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, was building an army that would challenge every assumption about modern warfare. Giap was not a professional soldier in any conventional sense. He had never attended a military academy, never commanded regular troops in a traditional battle. His formal military education consisted of reading books on strategy and tactics in French libraries during his student days in Paris. Yet this amateur general would prove more innovative and effective than graduates of St. Cyr and West Point who opposed him. His genius lay not in following established military doctrine, but in completely reimagining how wars could be fought and won. The French military establishment viewed the Viet Minh as a ragtag collection of peasant soldiers armed with outdated weapons and motivated by communist propaganda. French intelligence reports consistently underestimated both the size and capability of Giap's forces. Colonial commanders assumed that superior European training, modern equipment, and air superiority would quickly crush any resistance. They planned for a conventional campaign that would restore French authority within months. The reality proved devastatingly different. Giap had studied not just European military history, but the successful resistance movements that had challenged imperial powers throughout history. He understood that conventional warfare would play to French strengths, so he developed a strategy that turned French advantages into weaknesses. Where the French expected massed battles, he offered guerrilla warfare. Where they sought decisive engagements, he provided endless harassment and ambush. Where they relied on fixed positions and supply lines, he created a mobile army that could appear anywhere and disappear just as quickly. The French response revealed the fundamental arrogance that had always characterized colonial thinking. Rather than adapting their strategy to meet this new kind of warfare, they doubled down on conventional tactics that had worked against European enemies. They built more fortified positions, deployed more heavy equipment, and increased their troop strength year after year. Each escalation simply provided Giap with more targets and more opportunities to demonstrate French vulnerability. French casualties mounted steadily as the conflict dragged on. Young conscripts from France found themselves fighting in jungle terrain they had never imagined, against an enemy they could rarely see. The romantic image of colonial warfare, with its dress uniforms and ceremonial parades, gave way to the grim reality of jungle rot, booby traps, and sudden death from invisible snipers. Letters home described not glorious victories but endless patrols through hostile territory where every village might harbor enemy fighters. The economic burden grew equally crushing. By 1954, the United States was paying 80% of France's war costs, contributing $3 million per day to a conflict that showed no sign of ending. The irony was bitter. France, which had prided itself on imperial self-sufficiency, now depended on American financial support to maintain its colonial empire. The war that was supposed to restore French prestige was instead demonstrating French weakness to the entire world. Meanwhile, Giap was transforming his guerrilla force into something unprecedented in colonial warfare, a peasant army capable of conventional military operations without losing its guerrilla flexibility. His soldiers learned to construct artillery pieces from scrap metal, to manufacture ammunition in jungle workshops, to move heavy weapons through terrain that French engineers considered impassable. They developed supply networks so sophisticated that French intelligence officers never fully understood how enemy forces could appear in strength hundreds of miles from any known base. The psychological dimension of the conflict proved equally important. While French propaganda emphasized the communist threat and the need to defend Western civilization, Viet Minh messages focused on simpler, more powerful themes: independence, dignity, and the right of Vietnamese people to govern themselves. These appeals resonated across political boundaries, attracting support from non-communist nationalists who might otherwise have opposed Giap's forces. French colonial administrators found themselves increasingly isolated from the populations they claimed to govern. Village chiefs who had once been reliable collaborators now provided information reluctantly or not at all. Urban intellectuals who had embraced French culture began questioning whether French rule could ever serve Vietnamese interests. Even Catholics, traditionally supportive of French presence due to religious ties, began wondering whether independence might not serve their community better than continued colonial subordination. The strategic situation deteriorated steadily as Giap's forces grew stronger and more confident. What had begun as isolated guerrilla attacks evolved into coordinated operations involving thousands of fighters. French outposts found themselves under siege for weeks at a time. Supply convoys required massive escorts that still could not guarantee safe passage through increasingly hostile territory. The initiative had passed completely to the Vietnamese forces, leaving French commanders in the position of reacting to enemy moves rather than implementing their own strategy. By 1953, French military leaders were desperately searching for a way to regain the strategic initiative. They needed a decisive victory that would restore French prestige and demonstrate that European military superiority could still prevail in colonial conflicts. The solution they devised would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. The plan was elegantly simple in its conception and devastatingly flawed in its execution. French forces would establish a fortified base in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, deep in Viet Minh-controlled territory. This base would serve as bait, forcing Giap to attack a prepared position where French firepower advantages would prove decisive. The Vietnamese would be crushed in conventional battle, their army destroyed, and their political movement discredited. French rule would be restored through a single brilliant stroke. General Henri Navarre, the French commander who approved this strategy, was convinced that Giap lacked the logistical capability to sustain a major offensive so far from his main supply bases. French intelligence estimated that the Viet Minh could deploy at most 20,000 fighters to attack Dien Bien Phu, and these would be poorly supplied and unable to maintain a prolonged siege. French artillery and air power would decimate any assault force that attempted to storm the prepared positions. The selection of Dien Bien Phu itself reflected colonial arrogance at its most dangerous. The valley was surrounded by hills that offered perfect artillery positions to any attacking force. The single airstrip that would supply the garrison was vulnerable to enemy fire from multiple directions. The monsoon season would limit air support for months at a time. Every aspect of the terrain favored the attacker rather than the defender, yet French planners dismissed these concerns with the casual confidence that had characterized colonial military thinking for generations. Giap recognized the opportunity immediately. Rather than avoiding the French trap, he would spring it in reverse. The isolated garrison at Dien Bien Phu would become the target of the largest and most sophisticated military operation in Vietnamese history. For months, tens of thousands of porters carried artillery pieces through jungle paths that French experts had declared impassable. Entire villages were mobilized to transport ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. The scale of this logistical achievement was staggering. Peasant farmers, many of whom had never seen artillery pieces before, learned to disassemble heavy guns, carry the components through jungle trails, and reassemble them in concealed positions overlooking the French base. Bicycles were modified to carry 10 times their normal load. Rivers were diverted to power workshops, manufacturing ammunition. An entire parallel economy emerged to support the coming battle. French reconnaissance flights detected some of this activity, but colonial commanders consistently underestimated its scope and significance. They assumed that primitive transportation methods could never support a major military operation. They believed that peasant soldiers lacked the technical knowledge to operate sophisticated weapons effectively. They convinced themselves that Vietnamese forces would collapse under the strain of maintaining such an ambitious undertaking. When the bombardment began on the 13th of March, 1954, French illusions shattered like glass in an earthquake. These forgotten battles did more than topple colonial governments or redraw maps. They shattered the fundamental psychology of empire itself, proving that determined resistance could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. From the Java Sea to Dien Bien Phu, from Malayan jungles to Indonesian islands, these conflicts revealed that European colonial dominance rested not on inherent superiority, but on myths that could be challenged and destroyed. The reverberations continue today, as nations across the developing world draw inspiration from leaders who refuse to accept that their fate should be decided in distant European capitals. History's true turning points often happen in places textbooks ignore,